For this afternoon, what we will be discussing are the compilation of SUTs at constant prices. I hope my screen is visible. Can someone confirm? Hello?
Yes, Dean.
All right. Thanks, Jen. Okay. So for this afternoon, as I said, I'll be covering constant price SUTs. So this is a walkthrough of the basics, and we'll start with the principles first. Then I'll follow it up with a step-by-step process in the on how to operationalize said concepts. Um, this session only covers the basics, an overview, if you may, of the constant SUT. There are specific considerations for each transaction category, which usually covers 2 weeks worth of workshop, which I won't be glossing over since you only have this an hour or two of space for discussing topics. My presentation takes the shape. It's in 3 points. First is an overview of the price and volume measures. Then I'll follow it up with a compilation of SUTs into two subparts. First are the concepts of constant SUTs, a little more specific than the price and volume measures. Then, as I mentioned a while ago, we'll operationalize it by the step-by-step process. Okay. So, the national accounts provide comprehensive data used for analyzing economic performance. We know that one of the main objectives of the national accounts is to provide comprehensive data in evaluating economic performance. So, we need data on major economic flows such as production, household consumption, capital formation. Um, these serve as inputs for informing policy. Current price estimates jointly embody changes in the price and changes in volume. This information constrains the analysis of productivity over time. What do you mean by this? At current price estimates, we're unable to associate whether or not a change is associated in the change of output, or is it an inflationary factor or an inflationary effect. That's why we need a constant price estimates to deconstruct changes in economy in real terms. Volume measures are basically a calculable and interpretable way of measuring changes in an economy's output controlling for price changes. These measures enable the analysis of real growth over time. In order to do this, the value changes for economic aggregates need to be split between changes arising from prices and changes arising in um, volume. For me to be able to pin this point down, let's use an illustration. The basic question usually is how much GDP did change over time, or in other words, how much higher was the gross domestic product in this year in compared to the previous year? Give me a second. Okay. To measured in dollar amounts, how much output has changed because that would be a more accurate measure of productivity. Let's assume that an economy has only one good A, and at year one, the value of its GDP is at 1,000 local currency units. The price of that good is, say, $1 or one local currency unit per unit. At the succeeding year, GDP grew, say, by 20%, which now has a value of 1,200 local currency units. Visually, the value of production at year one is represented. If we're going to use a graph, the year one is represented by this green rectangle. Your x axis is your prices or the change in prices over time, and your y axis is your level of volume. The vertical distance here represent the change in volume over time. So that's from 1,000 from 1,000 GDP to 1,200 GDP in the following year. Whereas the horizontal distance would represent the change in prices. When we undertake the measurement of the value of an economy's production, at previous year's prices, we hold the change in prices constant. Visually, this is now represented by the orange rectangle. What we're left with, what we're left with is to articulate how much the volume has changed in that span of time. Usually, that's represented by the yellow region of this illustration. I just want to have a step back. Now that we have visualized the deconstruction of price and volume measures, having these pieces of information allow us to know, with respect to productivity, how the level of output changed. That's one way we could look into or analyze the price and volume measures. Another analytical question is inflation. So this is useful for economies with a high concentration of a specific resource, since usually these are the products in the economy that are sensitive to price changes. Moving this discussion forward, let's discuss what do we mean when we say volume estimates. Current prices accounts that can be considered at an aggregation, the sum of the value of several transactions that occurred within a given period. But it's not as straightforward as when we're measuring quantities or volume. So the value of a transaction, excuse me, for a single product is given as value, which is represented by V, is equal to price times quantity. Value of a transaction concerning a single product is its price multiplied by the quantity. But at aggregated levels, quantity is more heterogeneous. A good example or a classic example are your agricultural products. While it's easy to classify, say for instance, apples, there are varieties of apples with varying price assigned to it. So at a more aggregated level, it's more difficult to assign a quantity uh, for, for us to be able to estimate a given value to it. So in other words, quantity becomes more heterogeneous. That's why at aggregated levels, we don't usually use the word quantity, rather we use the word um, volume. So um, as what I have mentioned, value is equal to price times volume. But when we analyze it, or when we summarize these numbers, at least for now, we'll use index for us to be able to articulate the change in value or the change in price and volume over time. So we'll use index. For aggregates, we can also decompose a transaction into price and volume measures. The value index gives us the change in any given flow from one period to the next. And these changes are attributed to a change in price or a change in volume or a combination of the two. Changes in values of economic flows, as I have mentioned, can be either pure price changes or volume changes. Um, okay. Now, now that we have that deconstruction, what are the principles of price and volume uh, measures? The first one is an elementary level of aggregation in the measurement of price and volume data. So, in other words, a detailed level of aggregation of products that can be used. This would vary from country to country, since each country would have their own configuration of the products existing in that economy. But the point here is we need to be able to have the most detailed level of information when we tackle price and volume measures. In the measurement of prices and volumes, a detailed level of aggregation is used, and this is usually referred to as the elementary level of aggregation. The measurement of prices and volumes should start from a detailed breakdown up until aggregating it to a point where we find it fit. Um, and for each product, distinguish for each transaction, a price index should be found with which the current price can be deflated, or a volume indicator should be found to extrapolate a base year value. In practice, the level of aggregation is at least as detailed as the distinguished products in the SUT. The second principle is the choice of index formula. Um, Volume measures available at the elementary level of aggregation shall be aggregated using the Spears formula to obtain volume measures of all national accounts. Then for um, aggregating price measures, we use the PASH formula. The formula, the Spears and the PASH formula is not featured in these slides. But the idea is there is different weighting when we talk about volume or when we talk about um, price measures. The last principle for the measurement of price and volume data is the non-additivity. Hello. Okay, I'll proceed. Is the non-additivity problem. Regardless whether an index is compiled through a base year or reference year, um, changing reference year should not affect the year-to-year indices. So whether or not, say, you assign a reference year in 2018 or a reference year in 2012, when you look at the series, it should not, the analysis of growth rates or the trend over time should not be affected by a specific choice of a reference year. Keeping year-to-year growth rates unchanged means re-referencing variables. So you re-reference your elementary index, your subgrouping of that group of products, for instance, or your overall aggregate. However, sometimes mathematically, um, there will be discrepancies when you have these re-referencing, by virtue that you might be using a different weight for a given year. So for instance, you have a CPI in 2012, and when you reference it to 2018, the details of that specific index might not add up when you re-reference it, by virtue that you might be using different weighting for you to arrive at that aggregated index. Um, the point here is we have to be cautious when you have a referencing of um, a base year or a reference year, um, and as much as possible preserve the behavior of the trend of the series that you are trying to look at. Contrary to current price data, data at constant prices cannot be directly observed. They have to be derived from current price data with a combination of appropriate price and quantity indicators. In terms of national aggregates, there are few ways to do this. Um, but at least for this afternoon, we'll just compare two of them. The first is the single deflation. It assumes that the value added grows at the same rate as your output. It uses a single price index that is applied both to inputs and your outputs, which basically goes back to the point that the way how you deflate your output is the same as the way how you deflate your value added. It's straightforward because you're only using one deflator. But the downside is it fails to capture relative price changes that can be significant and tend to either over or underestimate your GDP. It does not reflect textures in the changes in your inputs. That's why it's a little inferior as opposed to the double deflation. Double deflation uses independent deflators for inputs and outputs, and value added in volume terms is derived by the deflation of these two components. So, in other words, your output is deflated differently than your inputs. That goes without saying that this is the recommendation in the 2008 SNA, but the downside of this is that it's more data intensive. Um, as output and input prices are ideally compiled by product. Another difficulty of the double deflation is finding price indices for services. The reason why it's difficult to find the price index for services is that it's difficult to capture changes in volume in services, given that services are not directly observed. Um, More specifically, when the output price moves faster than the input price, um, single deflation, going back to the deflation, single deflation is expected to produce an overstatement of the volume estimate of the uh, value added. Okay, now that I have glossed over the ideas of the price and volume measures, let's now go how those ideas um, will be used as a frame of reference when we now go to the compilation of the supply news tables. A lot are already familiar with SUTs, but I'll use this as a premise to lay down all the succeeding points later on. So it's SUTs are integral to the um, compilation of GDP as it integrates the production, the expenditure, and income approaches. It also provides a systematic and detailed picture of an entire economy by providing information on the production processes and interdependencies, how products um, are used, and the income that's generated in the production. More importantly, it's designed to facilitate data confrontation and checking of the consistency of the data obtained from various um, sources. Okay. So as the name suggests, SUTs could be thought of into two parts. First is the supply table. It shows the supply of goods and services by product in the economy for a given period of time. Breaking these information down further, we can trace whether goods or services are sourced from, whether it's domestically produced or whether these are imported. A valuation matrix is also provided in the supply table, which allows us to bridge the valuation of the supply and use tables when we compare um, and compile it at basic prices and purchasers prices respectively. The use table, on the other hand, shows a parallel information. So the first um, part of the use table is your intermediate consumption, then final, sorry, your final consumers in the domestic market, your gross capital formation, and your transactions are represented by exports to the rest of the world. When we balance the supply and use table, um, there are three identities that hold true between these tables. First is that the total supply by products is equal to the total uses of these products. Second is that the total output by the industries is equal to the total input. This should be input to the total input of the industries in the production process. So that's your intermediate consumption and your value added. And as mentioned earlier, it produces a single and coherent annual um, GDP estimate. Compiling and establishing these tables at current prices sets the first stage in the compilation process in more detail. Um, there are two accounting identities, as I have mentioned a while ago. For any given product, the volume of output plus the volume of imports should be equal to the volume of all the uses in the economy. So that's your IC, your final consumption, your gross capital formation, and your exports. And for each industry, your output is should be equal to your intermediate consumption and your value added. Translating these concepts into constant SUTs. The use of constant price SUTs to measure GDP in real terms also ensure that the GDP growth at constant prices are consistent both at the production side and the expenditure side. So regardless if it's at current prices or constant prices, these identities should hold true. Now, what are the features of using the supply and use framework in compiling analysis at constant price estimates? Um, it, these features or these advantages could be viewed from two general perspectives. First is from the statistical point of view, and later in the next slide from the national accounts or from the user's point of view. Firstly, from the statistical compilation process standpoint, the SUT framework provides a readily available overview of the extensive set of transactions data, price indicators, and volume indicators, both on the supply and use side. It provides a way to trace where supply comes from and how it was consumed. Secondly, the framework gives us the necessary checks, the numerical consistency, reliability, and plausibility of supply and demand because they're all coherent in one framework. Another advantage is that since the constant price estimations are established in an accounting framework, it gives us volume indices and deflators of several variables and at different levels of aggregation that are interrelated in a systematic way. Um, by design, it provides a way to look at the tables as one set of information, allowing us to balance the whole data set, take into account uncertainties or weaknesses of underlying estimates. And lastly, the framework provides an opportunity to analyze the constant price estimates of values at basic prices in relation to their trade and transport margins, taxes on products. In other words, the framework allows to analyze both at basic prices and at purchasers' prices. From a user's point of view, what are the features or what are the benefits of using the supply and use framework? This is premised on the idea that the main objective of national accounts is to provide a comprehensive data which can be used for evaluating economic performance. Therefore, presenting constant price estimates in the supply and use framework presents unique advantages to the users. With the SET framework, information on economic growth and inflation can be derived at a sectoral level. Uh, Price changes and volume growth can be derived for industries and final demand categories, even on a product level, offering the opportunity to perform a detailed analysis. And lastly, um, the SET accounting framework um, allows for the derivation of price and volume measures of important balancing items. Um, this illustration here is the relationship of your current price SUT uh, to constant price SUT. It's called the H approach because it looks like the letter H. Um, the first stage of the compilation process using this illustration starts with an established SUT. For the purposes of this discussion, let's just focus on these broken line um, rectangle here. This figure um, on the vertical, on the left vertical arm represents the SUTs in current prices, and at your right are your constant SUDs. Linking current prices to constant prices is the process of deflation, showing the link between the current prices and the uh, volume terms. In terms of compiling the constant price SUTs, there are actually two methods in two methods. One is sequential approach, and the second one is the simultaneous approach. As the name indicates, the sequential method requires the compilation first of the current price SUT um, before compiling the constant SUT. So you do your balancing, your reconciliation at the current price SUT first before you compile the um, constant SUT. So put simply, this compilation process is more straightforward, takes into account that the current SCP is already given and can be completed one step after the other. The alternative method is the simultaneous approach, which balances both the current and constant price tables at the same time. This means that in the compilation process, current and constant price tables will be available. While these methods are both acceptable and used in practice, the sequential method can be preferred uh, over the simultaneous one for a list of reasons. Probably the most important reason is that the sequential method tends to be less complicated as one only deals with the current prices when doing the balancing. Another is that this method requires lesser data, hence is preferred particularly due to the lack of reliable data on a sufficiently detailed level. One setback of the sequential method is that there would be instances where problems will be encountered while compiling the constant price tables. Such problems would usually require adjustments in the current price tables. But since these are already balanced, changes or observations uh, that support those changes may not be implemented anymore. And this particular instance is where the simultaneous approach becomes better as it allows the joint analysis of the price, value, and volume indices in relation to each other. In doing so, the reliability and plausibility of all estimates can be checked and corrected using the balancing process both for the current and constant price estimates. Let's now go to the idea of choosing the data, specifically choosing the deflators, or evaluating the data that we have um, in terms of its soundness in the price and volume measures. First is the completeness of coverage. Completeness of the coverage of the product means that the index should represent the prices paid by consumers for exact group of products. For example, whether the indicator covers all of the products under the heading or just a selection of them, such as only products sold to households. The second general criteria for choosing deflators is the valuation. Index should follow the same valuation as the components being deflated. A good example of this is your producer price index, which represents your market output. And usually, the producer price index is at basic prices, absent of any price representation in your valuation margins. Inputs, on the other hand, so for instance, when you have um, a product being used by the industries, or say, for instance, a consumer price index, it should be valued at purchasers' prices. So this is what the second criteria um, wants to convey. The third and the fourth criteria for choosing deflators is that number three, it considers quality changes. When you have a volume change over time, not only are you looking at the actual quantity that's being changed, you're also looking into the change of quality of a given product from year T to year T plus one. So the index should be able to represent that change in quality. And lastly, well, it goes without saying that it should be consistent with the national accounts concepts. Usually, the your price or volume data would have an accompanying notes to it or metadata compilers should be able to look into how these price indices or how these volume indices are compiled and ensure that it's consistent with compilation of um, national accounts. The commonly used deflators or the commonly compiled deflators are the following. You have the producer price index, which represent the price changes of output. In some countries, they do have the services producer price index. Although for the countries that produce the services producer price index, there are a number of caveats in analyzing that index. Industrial purchasers price index is a representation of the price index for your intermediate consumption. So industries would have a list of products they do purchase as their excuse me as their intermediate consumption, and that could be represented by a price index. Consumer price index for the household final consumption expenditure and for some consumption of services. Imports and export price index usually come from the foreign trade statistics. Wholesale price index and retail price index are usually reports from wholesale and retail surveys. Wage index and volume index. This is not an exhaustive list of the commonly compiled indicators, but this is a good list um, if compilers would want to start compiling constant SUDs. Um, on top of the commonly compiled indicators, compilers could also derive indicators given data. So, three examples are the unit value index. So, the unit value index usually is coming from the volume and value information from trade databases such as Comtrade. So you can derive a value index using the value and the volume information in those databases. Mirror index also used in the trade database, um, the the trade relationship between two economies or two countries, and volume indicators from actual quantity or volume data. Usually, these are administrative reports, um, different from the volume index compiled by official statistics. There is a duality in the measurement of prices and volumes. One can either deflate a current year value with the price index, all or alternatively extrapolate a base year value using a volume index. So let's try to explore the two dualities of price and volume measures. Deflation is expected to yield more accurate results. A sample of price observations is normally more representative than an equally sized sample of quantity observations. Price index compilation is usually based on the fixed basket methodology. The prices of a fixed basket of precisely specified goods and services are compared between two periods. In this way, quality of the goods and services compared is held constant, and only the price index measures the pure price changes. However, either for a lack of information or for the checking whether or not our deflators data are indeed accurate, there are also volume indicators for extrapolation. This is to maximize the accuracy of the indicators to be nearly exhaustive um, observation of all transactions. Detailed quantity information in dealing with homogeneous products. Then the last method is the revaluation. This is usually for physical quantities of output and intermediate consumption, um, and revalued at the corresponding prices of the base year. Usually, revaluation is used in more apparent tangible production, such as agriculture and mining products. There are three data requirements to it. First is the quantity and price data at the elementary level. Second is the homogeneity of physical quantities for each product. Then lastly is the complete coverage of those um, quantities. And the value is divided by an appropriate index. So let's just run on into a numerical example. So for instance, you have a price at year zero or at year one, which is at $1, and you have um prices on the succeeding year, which is at 1.5. So evaluation is just taking into account the same quantity and looking into the change of prices over time, following these assumptions consistent. And the number of deflators and indicators that we will be using for the constant SUTs, there is what we call the ABC classification. The ABC classification helps us to adjudicate the quote unquote threat of our indicators. And given the differences of the data that we have, there are different possible methods in the estimation of prices and volumes. The ABC classification are classified according to their suitability. So the A method is the most appropriate method based on international recommendations. Um, B method are the methods that might slightly deviate from concepts but are still useful. Um, and the C methods are the methods that logically make sense, but um, as much as possible um, should be avoided. The ABC methods are useful um, are actually further illustrated for each transaction category. So for instance, there are ABC methods for deflation for agriculture, there are ABC methods for uh, certain manufacturing transactions or for services. So these ABC methods differ from each transaction by industry and by expenditure items. Let's now go to the step-by-step process of the uh, compilation of the constant price SUTs. So there are six major steps um, in compiling your constant price SUT. The first one is your data inventory. So compilation of deflators. Um, I did not mention here in the slides, but not only deflators, but other information. So if you have volume data, or if you have data that can articulate prices and volume changes over time, that's the first step. So data gathering is your step one. Step two is your derivation of weighted deflators for chosen SUT disaggregation. Usually SUTs that are published or that are analyzed are more aggregated, and there's a version of SUT that's more disaggregated. So in order for you to be able to bridge the elementary level SUT to the level of SUT or to the configuration of SUT that you want to analyze, you'll need to be able to weight the deflators for your SUT configuration. The third step is given the number of indicators that you have, you need to have a cell by cell assignment of the deflators coming from your weighted deflators. I'll discuss this further later. Your fourth step is the validation of assigned deflators. So there are certain checks whether or not your deflators can be used or whether it calls for a different or an alternative data that you can use for the deflation process. Then the step five is the estimation of your constant price SUTs. So as mentioned a while ago, there are various ways in order for you to be able to arrive from constant price estimates to sorry, from current price estimates to constant price estimates. Either you deflate, extrapolate, or revalue. Then the last step is the balancing of the SUT. So for the first step, um, you have the product configuration deflators. You need to be able to compile, excuse me, sorry. You need to be able to compile deflators on the level of configuration that's the most detailed to you. And this is a sample list of the deflators designed by product. Some deflators need to be able to have a correspondence. So for instance, your CPI is not configured by CPA or by CPC. CPI is classified by uh, POICOP, by individual uh, classification by purpose or by consumption. So you need to be able to have a correspondence table between POICOP and CPA or CPC. For MPA and XPI for trade data, we have HS codes, which you need to be able to bridge between the HS code and the CPC. There are also deflators configuration by industry. So usually these are your overall TPI by industry, your wage index, your volume index, construction price index, specifically for the construction industry, and other price indices. Now that you're assuming that you're able to compile um, deflators at the most disaggregated level, the second step is the weighting of the deflators. So from your most detailed product configuration, map it to the more aggregated product configuration. The same goes for industry configuration. The weighting of deflators assume that you have a reasonably balanced supply and use table. Um, so the supply and use table at current prices will be your uh, weighting factor for you to be able to have a uh, weighted deflator. The third step is the assignment of deflators. Um, you need to be able to assign appropriate deflator for a transaction category. So for instance, HFCE's deflator ideally is the weighted CPI, while for the exports of goods, it would be the weighted exports price index, or in some cases, your unit value index. The deflation methods would serve as a guide in the assignment deflators. So for example, agricultural production are deflated using the appropriate farm gate prices because farm gate prices represent the basic prices. For mining and quarrying, you might use volume data if an admin data for mining and quarrying is available. As I mentioned a while ago, um, there are criteria in which you might need to um, have an alternate look into your deflators. So um, just have a note of the deflators that you will be using as you might need to pivot from one deflator or from one data or from one indicator to the other. So this is an illustration of the ideal scenario of the deflators that you will be using for each region of the supply table. So for the domestic production, usually it's the producer price index. For imports, it's your imports price index. For the valuation margins, it's your trade and transport deflators. And for the taxes on products, it usually is the composite deflators. For your intermediate consumption matrix, it usually is the industry purchasers price index. For certain services, we use CPI, or if you have other deflators that you can use. For households, is it's CPI. For the non-market output, for NPIS and government, it's the non-market output method of um, deflation, and so on and so forth. Now, um, now that you have those deflators, there are certain criteria in validating whether or not your deflators um, is sound. This is not a strict criteria, but at least it gives you a peek or a look or on whether or not the deflators that you are using are reasonable. The first check is that your deflator should be stable. In other words, um, the prices of your goods and services would only range between a decrease of 15% and or an increase of 15%. The second check is that the prices of a given good should not be highly different for across industries. So for instance, the change of prices for electricity in a given industry, say in agriculture, should not be drastically different than the change of electricity prices in the industries and in the services. Um, the third check is that it's seldom do we encounter decreases in prices over time. So there's an expectation that your price index is increasing. Then lastly, if the prices of a particular industry's inputs are increasing, then there's an expectation that the prices of the output are also increasing. The fifth step is the estimation of constant price SUPs. Um, we would this step would give us actually not six but 12 tables. Six tables each for supply table and use table. So total of 12 tables. So you have first the supply and use table at current prices. The second table is your SUT price index. The third table is your SUT at previous year's prices. The fourth one is your SUT volume index. The fifth is your SUT of current prices at current prices of the previous year. Then value index. Now, The six tables here are interrelated. The relationship of current price SUT and previous price SUT is your um, price index. So the relationship of lines 1 and 3 is your price index. The relationship of your SUT at previous year's prices and the SUT at current prices of the previous year is your um, volume index. Then the relationship of the table 1, the current price SUT, and the current price SUT of the previous year is your value index. Um, it's a mouthful, but here, the value index is calculated as um, your current price SUT over your SUT at previous year's prices. The price index is your current SUT over, sorry, the value index is your current price SUT over the current price SUT of the previous year. Your price index is your current SUT over your constant SUT, or in this case, the SUT at previous year's prices. And the volume index is your constant SUT over current price SUT of the previous year. The last step is the simultaneous balancing. So I could not say this enough, but the product identity and the industry identity, both at current and constant prices, should hold true. The overall deflators should reflect the aggregated deflator. So for instance, if we stick to the idea that CPI is the ideal price index for the HFCE, then the overall HFCE price index should be the price index for the CPI. In some countries, however, especially published um, national accounts at constant prices, it might not be different, but the differences should not be significant. In the balancing process, we analyze the value, the price, and the volume by producer and by consumer per um, product. So, in summary, we could look into all of the tables by looking at the value index, the price index, and the volume index. Given that we have established the interrelations of these three, following the three um, tables, um, and you can make adjustments on the SUT based on which area is quote unquote problematic. So, for instance, if there is an issue in the value index, usually it's the current um, SUT, current price SUT, that can be adjusted. For volume index, it's the constant price SUT. I guess this ties back to the idea of the limitation of the sequential balancing, because when there is an issue in the value index, we're limited to only adjusting the price in the volume index. There's little that we can do when we have um, sequential balancing. Um, the last notes for the balancing process, assuming that it's simultaneous balancing, is determine the necessity for subsequent adjustments. So these items here are recommendations based on what we have previously compiled. So for instance, you kind of set the row and the column wise adjustments so that you preserve controls within the industry, assuming that you have already established your control totals. A second point, a second observation on this particular exercise is that current price estimates would have an effect on your changes in your price index and your volume index. Um, and if there's a need to adjust in the constant price estimates, determine whether or not it could be resolved by changes in your current price SUT. Um, so yes, I think that ends my presentation for this afternoon. I'd like to open the floor for comments or for questions. I hear none. If there are questions on, if there are questions,
You're the economist.
if there are, sorry, let's see. Um, if there are questions, you may DM me. Uh, I guess you could end here. Thank you, everyone.